Everyone thinks building the dashboard is the hardest part. Gotta pick a tool, master it, visualize the data in a way that stakeholders can understand and make decisions. But there's an entire process that happens before even a single chart gets built. And most of the people in the room don't even know about it until they have to work on it. I'm an analytics engineer, and for the past 2 years, I've been building data pipelines and dashboards to help a healthcare company make better data-driven decisions. And in this video, I'll be showing you the 3 stages of this end-to-end process, from sourcing the data, moving it through pipelines, and building data models for the dashboard. And at the end of the video, you'll realize that building the dashboard is just the last 20% of the job. So a stakeholder comes to you with a request. For example, maybe they want a dashboard that shows the revenue by diagnosis. Simple enough on the surface, but the first question isn't usually what kind of charts you want to see. It's usually, where does the data actually live? So for this example, we need 2 kinds of data. One is the diagnosis data and one more is the revenue data. And most of the times in organizations, different types of data don't actually live in the same location. So for example, in my organization, we have different types of data source. Firstly, the hospital information system, which is sort of like the hospital database. And then we have accounting systems, which is a separate database. And then we have other third-party apps or even Excel files. So the first job is actually trying to figure out where the data is coming from. And in our case, we have the diagnosis data and the revenue data. And to figure this out, usually you talk with the stakeholders or the subject matter experts. So in this case, maybe for the finance data, I might go to the finance department and ask them, okay, where do you store the revenue data? How can I get it? Are there any processing I gotta do so that the reported numbers are the same ones that the management always looks at? So all this mapping comes way before we even build a pipeline, because the last thing you want is to build a full pipeline and realize that you're missing certain tables, you're missing certain fields, and you can't complete the dashboard, and then the project gets delayed, and we don't want that. So once you've figured out where all the data is, and for this example, diagnosis data will be in the HIS and the revenue data is coming from the accounting system, we can move on to build the pipelines. Now that we know where both our datasets resides, we need to move it to a location where we can work with it, because we can't be tampering with the source system data. So for this case, there are mainly 2 scenarios. If your organization mainly works with Excels and SharePoints, then the data processing steps would be done within those files, and then later on use these files as the data source for your Power BI dashboards or any other analysis. The second case, which is my case, for bigger organizations, they usually have dedicated data platforms or at least a data warehouse to store this data. So in my case, we have a data warehouse to store all this data from various sources into a centralized location to become the source of truth for the organization. And in this data warehouse, we split it into 3 layers using the medallion architecture. So the first would be the bronze layer, and this is where we just dump all the raw files as it is from the data source. We don't do any processing. Then we have the silver layer, which has some basic cleanup done, for example, like formatting data types, checking for blanks and dealing with it, standardizing text fields, and so on. So you can think of it as like the cleaned version of the bronze layer. Then we have the gold layer, which is more specific to use cases or functions. So in our organization, we split it up to different departments. So like finance data resides in the finance data mart, clinical data is in the clinical data marts, HR for HR. For our case, our revenue data should be going into our finance mart, and then our diagnosis data should be going into the clinical mart. So that's pretty much the concept, but how does it actually move? This is where we use a tool called Azure Data Factory and also SQL stored procedures. Azure Data Factory is just like a cloud computing tool to build data pipelines. I believe there are others in the market too, like AWS and stuff. But yeah, the concept's the same. So basically we build pipelines to query the source data. So we'll have one step to query the source data and move it to our raw zone in our data warehouse. And then we'll have a stored procedure, which is basically just a SQL script in the data warehouse. And the pipeline would call this stored procedure to move data from the bronze layer into the silver layer while applying all these cleanup steps. And then we'll have another stored procedure called by the pipeline to move this data into their dedicated marts in the gold layer. And then from here, we can then use it for analysis, dashboard, and all that stuff. For our example, the stakeholder wanted revenue by diagnosis. Now we have our revenue data in the finance mart and our diagnosis data in the clinical mart, but we need to join them to build a combined data model so that we can use it in our dashboard. And this is where we use SQL queries and to join these two tables based on specific keys. Now, how do we know what to use? This is where the important part of mapping out all the source data comes into play. See, if we don't map it out correctly in the first step, then now we will be kind of clueless on how to join these two tables. But since we are very familiar with how the data is from the source data, we will know exactly how to join these two tables to get the correct result. So I will use SQL here to create these data models. I know some databases also allow you to use notebooks, so you can actually use Python to do this as well. But I would say SQL is quite universal when it comes to databases and all this ETL. So if you need to pick one to learn, I think SQL is a great start. So once the data model is created, I just point it to the dashboard. I will build the visuals using this data model as the source. So next time you see a dashboard, you know that there's an entire pipeline behind it, starting from sourcing data from various sources, cleaning it up, joining them into a data model, and finally using it as a data source for the dashboard, which is just the last 20% of this whole process. And that's usually how projects go for analytics engineers. So that's all for this one. Catch you on the next one. Peace.